all its crooked, magical existence. Rooms stacked upon rooms like a child's haphazard tower of blocks. The house had hummed with noise. Molly's voice calling up the stairs, Arthur's tinkering in the shed, the wireless crackling with Celestina Warbeck, footsteps thundering overhead, arguments about Quidditch teams, the perpetual bang and clatter of 7-6 children living their lives in spaces too small to contain them. Now, silence pressed against the walls like something physical. Molly Weasley stood in her kitchen, hands submerged in dishwater that had gone cold an hour ago. She couldn't remember why she'd filled the basin. The plates from yesterday, or was it the day before, sat untouched on the counter. Someone had made tea. The cups formed a circle on the scrubbed wooden table, their contents filmed over and forgotten. The clock on the wall ticked. All the hands pointed to home except one. One hand had stopped moving entirely. Molly's eyes traveled to it without permission, the way a tongue finds a broken tooth. Fred's hand. It had spun wildly during the battle, oscillating between mortal peril and traveling, and lost before finally, terribly, settling on a place the clock had never shown before. Not mortal peril, not lost, just still. Arthur had wanted to take it down. Molly had hexed him before the words fully left his mouth. She pulled her hands from the water. They were red and wrinkled, unfamiliar. The wedding ring caught the weak afternoon light filtering through the gingham curtains. How many times had these hands smoothed Fred's hair when he was small? Cleaned scraped knees, swatted him away from cooling biscuits. She had touched her son's face one final time in the great hall, and his cheek had been cold, and now her hands were cold too, and she couldn't seem to make them warm again. The garden gnomes chittered outside, life continuing, the world turning. Absurd. Molly dried her hands on her apron, the same apron she'd been wearing for 3 days, and walked to the stairs. Each step creaked its familiar greeting. She knew every sound this house made, every groan and sigh of settling wood. The 3rd step whistled. The 7th groaned like an old man. The burrow was ancient and temperamental, and hers, and it had always been full of life. The landing stretched before her. 6 bedroom doors, all closed. Ron's door, decorated with Chudley Cannon's posters that peeled at the corners. He'd barely left his room since they'd returned, emerging only when Harry visited. The two of them sitting in silence that somehow said everything. Ginny's door, marked with a keep-out sign that had been there since she was 11. She was in the orchard now, Molly knew, throwing quaffles at makeshift hoops with a violence that made Molly's chest ache. Bill and Charlie's old room, empty now that Bill had Shell Cottage and Charlie had returned to Romania 3 days after the funeral, his eyes hollow with the need to be anywhere but here. Percy's door, the newest addition to this homecoming. He'd arrived the day after they'd buried Fred, carrying a small case and wearing robes too formal for grief. He hadn't asked permission, just climbed the stairs to his old room and shut the door, and he'd barely emerged since. Molly heard him sometimes, pacing, back and forth, back and forth. The floorboards told his story. Guilt walked in circles, and at the end of the hall, the twins' room. Molly's feet carried her there, though she hadn't meant to walk this direction. The door was painted with fading magical graffiti. Greddon Forge's Magnificent Emporium, in letters that occasionally rearranged themselves. A skiving snack box label was stuck to the door frame, a scorch mark from some long-ago experiment decorated the lower panel. The door was locked. George had locked it the first night home and hadn't come out since. Molly pressed her palm to the wood. She could feel the warmth of enchantments underneath, the pulse of her son's magic on the other side. Alive, still alive. She had to remember that. 7 children, and 6 of them still breathed. And she should be grateful. Everyone said she should be grateful. But gratitude felt like a betrayal when Fred was in the ground, and George was locked in a room that had been built for 2. "George," she said softly, "I've made soup." She hadn't. The kitchen was full of casseroles from neighbors, from order members, from people who didn't know what else to do with their hands. Molly hadn't cooked since the battle, hadn't been able to bear the thought of preparing food that Fred would never taste. No answer came from behind the door. "You need to eat, love." Silence. "Please." The word cracked. Molly pressed her forehead to the door, one hand still flat against the wood, and breathed. Just breathed. She couldn't break. Not yet. Someone had to hold them all together, and it had always been her job, hadn't it? She was the mother, the center, the one who kissed scraped knees and mended broken hearts and made everything right again. But she couldn't make this right. The door remained locked. Molly turned away, her vision blurred, and nearly collided with Percy on the landing. He stood in his doorway, half-shadowed. He'd lost weight. They all had. Grief was an appetite suppressant that no potion could cure. His robes hung loose on his frame, and his glasses sat crooked on his nose, and he looked young suddenly. Not the ministry official, not the one who'd chosen sides, just her 3rd son, lost and hurting. "Mum," he said. "Percy." She wiped her eyes quickly. "I didn't hear you." "I wanted to." He stopped, started again. "Should I try? To talk to George?" "I don't think he wants to talk to anyone, dear." Percy's jaw tightened. He looked at the twins' door with an expression that Molly couldn't quite pass. Longing, regret, the weight of words unsaid. "I should have been here," Percy whispered. "All those years, I should have been here. You're here, now. It's too late." "It's not." Molly reached for him, but Percy stepped back, a reflex. She let her hand fall. "You came back. You fought beside us. Fred knew." "Don't." Percy's voice went sharp. "Please don't tell me what Fred knew. I said terrible things. I missed years. I can't." He broke off, pushing his glasses up with shaking fingers. "I'm going to help Dad in the shed." He fled down the stairs before Molly could respond, his footsteps echoing through the too quiet house. Molly stood alone on the landing. The burrow settled around her with its familiar creaks. The ghoul in the attic thumped once, twice, then went silent. Even he seemed to understand that noise felt wrong now. She descended the stairs, slowly. Through the kitchen window, she could see Arthur in his shed, surrounded by muggle plugs and batteries and broken toasters. He was holding a rubber duck, turning it over and over in his hands without really seeing it. Percy appeared in the doorway, hesitant, and Arthur looked up. Father and son regarded each other for a long moment, before Arthur nodded to a stool. Percy sat. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They simply existed in the same space, and it was enough. In the orchard, Ginny threw another quaffle. It sailed wide, missing the hoop entirely, and she screamed, a wordless sound of fury and anguish that sent the garden gnomes scattering. She collapsed into the grass, her shoulders shaking, and Molly watched through the window as her only daughter, her baby girl, her fierce, bright Ginny, sobbed into her knees. Molly's hand was on the door handle before she realized she'd moved. But she stopped. Ginny needed to rage, needed to scream and cry and fall apart where no one could see. Molly understood. Wasn't that exactly what she wanted to do? Just collapse and keen and let the grief tear her open. But mothers didn't get that luxury. Mothers held steady. Mothers kept going. She released the handle, turned back to the kitchen, looked at the cold tea, the unwashed dishes, the casseroles stacked in mismatched containers. Her wand sat on the counter. She'd barely used magic since the battle. Every spell felt wrong somehow, frivolous, when Fred would never cast another charm. When his wand, sat in a drawer upstairs, its magic cooling, dying, becoming just a stick of wood. But the dishes needed washing. The house needed tending. Life, impossibly, continued. Molly picked up her wand. The wood was warm, familiar, responsive. She flicked it at the basin, and hot water streamed from the tap. Another flick, and soap bubbles frothed. The dishes rose from the counter in a gentle procession, lowering themselves into the water, and Molly guided them through the motions of cleaning with small, precise movements. Magic, the thing that made them different, the thing that made them special, the thing that hadn't saved Fred. A sob built in her throat. She swallowed it, kept washing, kept moving. One dish, another. The rhythm was mechanical, soothing in its mindlessness. Behind her, footsteps on the stairs. She didn't turn. Whoever it was could announce themselves or leave. She couldn't manage conversation, couldn't manage the careful dance of normal. Mum. Ron's voice, rough with disuse. Molly turned. Her youngest son stood in the kitchen doorway, tall and gangly and heartbroken. He'd been Fred's shadow once. Fred and George and little Ronnie, trailing after his older brothers, desperate to be included in their schemes. And they'd let him, most times, teased him and pranked him and loved him fiercely the way brothers did. "Is there tea?" Ron asked. Such a simple question. So magnificently normal. "I'll make some," Molly said. She set the kettle on the stove, by hand, not magic, needing the simple task, and retrieved cups from the cabinet. 2 cups. Ron sat at the table, his long legs folded awkwardly under the scarred wood. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the clock. "It's stuck," he said quietly. "I know. We could get it fixed. There's probably someone—" "No." Ron nodded. He understood. The clock wasn't broken. It was accurate. That was worse. The kettle whistled. Molly poured water over tea leaves, watching them unfurl in the heat, releasing their bitter perfume. She added milk to Ron's cup, too much, the way he'd liked it when he was small, and set it before him. "Thanks," he murmured. They sat in silence. Outside, the sun edged lower. Golden light spilled across the kitchen, illuminating dust motes and the rings left by forgotten teacups and the empty chair where Fred used to sit, leaning back on 2 legs, grinning about something, always grinning. "Harry's coming by tomorrow," Ron said finally. "If that's all right." "Of course it's all right. He's always welcome here." "He's not sleeping either." Ron traced the rim of his cup. "Hermione says he wakes up screaming, thinks he's back in the forest, thinks he's—" Ron's voice caught. "We all are, aren't we? Back there, all the time." Molly reached across the table and covered her son's hand with hers. His fingers were so large now, a man's hands, but she could still remember when they were tiny, sticky with jam, reaching for her. "It gets easier," she lied. With time. Does it? I don't know. The honesty hung between them. Ron's eyes met hers, and she saw in them the same raw wound she felt in herself. They were all bleeding, all trying to staunch wounds that wouldn't close. I keep expecting him to walk through the door, Ron whispered. Keep thinking I hear his voice. George's voice, but it sounds like... He stopped, swallowed hard. It's not fair. No, Molly agreed. It's not. He was supposed to. Ron's voice broke. We were supposed to have time. There was nothing to say to that. No comfort to offer. Molly squeezed Ron's hand, and they sat together as the kitchen grew darker and the tea grew cold, and somewhere upstairs, behind a locked door, George grieved in the room that was suddenly too large. When Arthur and Percy came in from the shed, covered in grease and exhaustion, Molly heated soup, one of the casseroles. Fleur had made it, chicken and herbs, and ladled it into bowls. They ate together at the table, the five of them, and the empty chairs seemed to multiply. Fred's chair, Bill's chair, Charlie's chair. Ginny finally came in from the orchard, grass-stained and red-eyed, and took her seat without speaking. 6 Weasleys at a table that had held 9, 10 if you counted Harry, 11 with Hermione. The table had always been crowded, elbows knocking, reaching for bread, pass the potatoes, don't hex your sister at dinner. Now it felt vast, an ocean of wood between each of them. We should say grace, Molly heard herself say. They all looked at her. When had they last said grace? Years ago, maybe, before the war, before everything. But Arthur nodded. They joined hands, the chain incomplete, gaps where Bill and Charlie and George should have been, and bowed their heads. Molly opened her mouth. No words came. What was there to be grateful for? That 6 survived, that the war was over, that Voldemort was gone. It all felt hollow. Fred was still dead. Her son was still in the ground. Gratitude was ashes in her mouth. Thank you for this food, Arthur said softly when the silence stretched too long. And for family, and for home. For home, Percy echoed quietly. They ate. The soup was good. Fleur was an excellent cook, but Molly tasted nothing. She moved the spoon from bowl to mouth in mechanical motions, swallowing because bodies needed fuel, because she had to model something for her children, because stopping felt like surrender. After dinner, Ron and Ginny returned to their rooms. Percy hesitated, then climbed the stairs. Arthur went back to the shed, needing the solitude of his muggle artifacts. Molly washed the dishes again, by hand this time, needing the sting of hot water, the simple task of scrubbing, and stared out the window at the darkening sky. Stars emerged, one by one. Fred had loved astronomy. Not the class, but the actual stars. He and George used to sneak onto the roof and point out constellations, making up stories about wizards flying between them on brooms made of starlight. The kitchen was clean. The house was quiet. Molly climbed the stairs one more time, past the closed doors, to the twins' room. She pressed her ear to the wood. Inside, so faintly she might have imagined it, she heard crying. "Oh, George," she whispered. She slid down to sit against the door, her back to the wood, and stayed there as night deepened and the burrow creaked around her, keeping vigil, bearing witness, waiting for a door that might never open, for a son who might never emerge, for healing that felt impossible but had to come, eventually, somehow, because they were Weasleys. They survived, even when survival felt like the crueler curse. The morning post arrived with a flutter of brown wings and a sharp rap against the kitchen window. Molly looked up from her tea, her third cup, though she'd barely touched the others, and watched the barn owl hover expectantly. It took 3 heartbeats longer than it should have to rise and open the window. 3 heartbeats where she considered simply ignoring it, letting the owl tire itself out and fly away, taking whatever news or condolences or well-meaning intrusions it carried back to wherever it came from. But that wasn't how things worked. Life demanded participation, even from those who no longer wished to participate. She opened the window. The owl swooped in, dropped a rolled parchment on the table, and departed without waiting for treats or payment. Even the owls seemed to understand that the burrow wasn't what it used to be. The letter was from Charlie. She recognized his hasty scrawl before she even unrolled it. Mum and Dad, Romania is cold this time of year. The dragons are restless with the temperature changes. Norberta, had her eggs, 12 of them. Hagrid will be pleased. I'm keeping busy. The work helps. Fire-breathing creatures don't leave much room for thinking. I'm sorry I left so soon. I'm sorry I keep leaving. I just tell everyone I love them. Tell George I'm here if he needs me. I know I'm not really, but tell him anyway. I'll write again soon. Charlie Molly traced the words with one finger. Her second oldest son, halfway across Europe, tending dragons because it was easier than facing the empty space in his family. She couldn't blame him. Hadn't she herself considered running? Getting on a broom and just flying until the grief couldn't follow? But mothers didn't run. Mothers stayed. She placed the letter on the growing stack beside the bread bin. There were dozens now. Letters from former students, of Fred and George, from customers, from friends, from people whose names Molly didn't even recognize, but who felt compelled to share their memories. Fred once made me laugh so hard I cried. George gave my daughter a free pygmy puff when she was sad. They brought light to dark times, past tense. Everything was past tense now. Anything important? Arthur stood in the doorway, still in his nightshirt despite the late morning hour. He'd stopped going to the ministry. Kingsley had given him leave, indefinite, open-ended, the kind of compassion that felt like pity. Her husband looked smaller somehow, as if grief had compressed him, folding him in on himself. Charlie, Molly said. He's well. The dragons are keeping him busy. Arthur nodded. He crossed to the kettle and poured himself tea, movements slow and careful, as if he'd forgotten how his limbs worked and had to relearn each gesture. He sat across from her, and they occupied the silence together. This had become their morning ritual, sitting, not speaking, existing in parallel rather than together. It wasn't that they had nothing to say. They had too much to say. A lifetime of words, of grief, of why, our son, why Fred, why any of them. But speaking it aloud made it real, and real was unbearable. I should go to the shop, Arthur said finally. Check on things. Make sure the wards are holding. George won't like that. George isn't managing anything from his room. They both glanced at the ceiling, as if they could see through wood and plaster to the locked door upstairs. 4 days now. 4 days since George had emerged. Molly left trays outside the door, soup, sandwiches, biscuits, and the trays vanished, so he was eating. But that was the only evidence he still lived. He needs time, Molly said. He needs to not starve himself in that room. Arthur, I know. Her husband rubbed his face, exhaustion etched in every line. I know. I just don't know what to do, how to help, how to fix this. You can't fix this. Then what good am I? The question hung in the air, raw and painful. Molly reached across the table, found Arthur's hand, and held it. His wedding ring pressed against her palm, warm and solid and real. They had been married 33 years, had raised 7 children in a house held together by magic and stubbornness, had survived 2 wars, countless dangers, threats to their family that should have broken them. This might be the thing that finally did. We keep going, Molly whispered. That's what we do. We keep going. Arthur's eyes met hers, and she saw her own devastation reflected back. But he nodded, squeezed her hand, kept going. By afternoon, the Burrow had achieved something almost resembling activity. Molly forced herself into the garden, though every plant seemed to mock her with its growth. Life continuing. Roots drinking water, leaves reaching for sun. The whole ignorant cycle of existence proceeding, as if Fred hadn't died, as if the world hadn't ended on the 2nd of May. She knelt in the dirt anyway, pulling weeds with vicious efficiency. The earth was damp from yesterday's rain, rich and loamy, and it stained her fingers black. Good. She wanted the stain, wanted the proof of doing something, anything, even if it was pointless. The garden gnomes watched her from behind the runner beans, chittering softly. She'd normally chase them off, but today she let them stay. Their presence was oddly comforting, small, ugly, persistent. They didn't care about human grief. They just wanted to steal cabbages and dig holes. Simple problems, simple solutions. Mrs. Weasley? Molly looked up. Bill stood at the garden gate, Fleur beside him. Her eldest son had visited every day since the funeral, sometimes with his wife, sometimes alone, checking in with the grim determination of someone who'd taken on the responsibility of holding everyone together. It should have been a comfort. Instead, it felt like failure, that Bill felt he needed to parent his own parents. We brought lunch, Fleur said, holding up a basket. I made coq au vin and tarte tatin for after. You don't need to keep feeding us, Molly said, rising from the dirt. Her knees ached. Everything ached. I know. Fleur's smile was gentle. But I will anyway. They went inside. Bill set the table while Fleur heated the food with careful warming charms, filling the kitchen with a smell of wine-braised chicken and herbs. It was a good smell, a living smell. Molly's stomach turned. Where is everyone? Bill asked. Ron's upstairs. Ginny's in the orchard. Your father's at the shop. Percy's... Molly paused. Actually, I'm not sure where Percy is. The pond, Fleur said quietly. I saw him on the walk up. He is sitting by the water, doing nothing. Of course he was. Percy, who'd spent years doing everything, proving himself through action and achievement, had discovered that doing nothing was the only thing that made sense now. You couldn't organize grief, couldn't file it away in neat categories, couldn't write a memo that would make it manageable. Bill went to fetch Ron while Fleur laid out the meal. Ginny appeared without being called, drawn by the activity or perhaps just tired of being alone. She sat at the table, muddy and disheveled, and said nothing. Ron followed Bill down the stairs, Harry trailing behind him like a shadow. Harry. Molly's heart clenched at the sight of him. Her honorary son, the boy who'd lost so much, who'd died and come back and saved them all. He looked haunted, thin. His eyes held the same 1,000-yard stare she'd seen in Arthur's face after the First War. Harry, love, she said, and pulled him into a hug. He stiffened for a moment, then collapsed into her embrace, and Molly held him the way she couldn't hold George, couldn't hold Fred, couldn't hold any of them tightly enough to keep them safe. Harry's shoulders shook, but he made no sound. Silent tears, the kind that hurt worse than sobbing. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her shoulder. "I'm so sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for. He died because of me. They all did. Fred, Remus, Tonks, Colin." "Stop." Molly pulled back, gripping his shoulders. "You listen to me, Harry James Potter. Fred died fighting Voldemort, fighting for a world worth living in. That was his choice. Do you understand? His choice." Harry's face crumpled. He nodded, but she could see he didn't believe her. Guilt was its own kind of prison, and Harry had locked himself inside. They ate together, the six of them, around the table that felt too large. Fleur's cooking was, as always, exquisite. The chicken fell off the bone, tender and rich. The potatoes melted in the mouth. But eating felt performative, a show they put on to convince each other they were still human, still capable of normal things. Bill tried to make conversation. "Gringotts wants me back next week. Apparently, there's still rubble to clear from the dragon escape." No one responded. The dragon escape. Fred had been alive then. They'd all been alive. It was only weeks ago, but it felt like a different lifetime. "Hermione's parents," Ron said abruptly. "She found them. In Australia. She's trying to reverse the memory charm." "That's good," Molly managed. "I'm glad. She says it's delicate work, says she might have damaged." Ron stopped, swallowed. "She's afraid she hurt them by trying to protect them." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. How many times had they all tried to protect each other? How many secrets kept, lies told, dangers hidden? And in the end, none of it had mattered. The people they'd lost were still lost. Ginny pushed back from the table suddenly, her chair scraping. "I can't do this." "Ginny," Bill started. "Don't." She looked around at all of them, her eyes blazing with tears and fury. "Don't tell me to sit here and pretend this is fine. Don't tell me to eat and talk about normal things like Fred isn't dead, like everything isn't." Her voice broke. "I can't. I just can't." She fled. The door slammed behind her, and through the window, Molly watched her daughter break into a run, heading for the orchard, for the sky, for anywhere but here. "I'll go," Harry said quietly, but Molly shook her head. "Let her be. She needs to rage." They finished the meal in silence. Fleur cleared the plates with efficiency, her movements graceful even in grief. She was good at this, at being present without demanding anything. Molly appreciated it more than she could say. "George," Bill asked, "has he—" "No." Bill's jaw tightened. "Maybe I should try to talk to him." "You think he'll listen to you when he won't listen to me?" "I don't know, Mum, but I have to try something." Molly wanted to argue, to protect George from even well-meaning intrusion, but she was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of holding the line. If Bill wanted to try, let him try. Let them all try. Maybe one of them would find the magic words that would unlock that door. Bill climbed the stairs. Molly heard his footsteps overhead, heard him pause outside the twins' room, heard the soft knock. "George, it's Bill. Can I come in?" Silence. "I'm not going to tell you to come out. I'm not going to say it gets better, or that Fred would want you to. Any of that rubbish. I just want to talk." More silence. Then faintly, "Go away." At least it was a response. At least George was still speaking, even if only to refuse. "I'm going to sit here," Bill said, "outside the door, and I'm going to tell you about work, about the dragons at Gringotts, about the repairs. You don't have to listen. You don't have to respond. But I'm here." And he did. Molly heard him settle against the door, heard the low murmur of his voice as he talked about nothing, about everything, filling the silence with words that George probably wasn't hearing but needed anyway. Fleur touched Molly's arm gently. "Come. We will make tea and sit in the garden. The sun is out. You should rest, even for a moment." Molly let herself be led outside. They sat on the bench Arthur had built years ago, when the children were small, and Fleur poured tea from a pot she'd brought in her infinite preparedness. The sun was indeed out, warm and bright, indifferent to suffering. "In France," Fleur said softly, "we have a saying, 'Le chagrin dure toute la vie.' Grief lasts a lifetime, but so does love. They exist together. One does not erase the other." "That's not very comforting," Molly said. "No, but it is true." They sat in the garden, drinking tea, while inside the house, Bill talked to a locked door, and Ron sat with Harry and Ginny, threw quaffles at the sky, and somewhere, somehow, life continued. Evening fell with its usual quiet insistence. The sun set, the stars emerged, and the Burrow's windows glowed with lamplight. Percy finally appeared from the pond, soaked to the knees, carrying a handful of reeds for reasons he didn't explain. Arthur returned from the shop with news that the wards were holding, but the inventory was a mess. George had sent off the employees weeks ago before the battle, and no one had been back since. "Someone needs to sort it," Arthur said. "The pygmy puffs alone. They're breeding in the storeroom." "Let them breed," Ron muttered. Arthur didn't argue. Dinner was leftovers from Fleur's lunch. They ate quickly, efficiently, anxious to return to their separate corners of grief. But as Molly began clearing plates, a tapping came at the window. Another owl, a sleek, tawny one, bearing a rolled parchment, sealed with official-looking wax. Arthur took it, broke the seal, and read. His face went carefully blank. "What is it?" Molly asked. "Ministry. They're awarding Fred an Order of Merlin, 3rd class, posthumously." He set the letter down as if it burned. "They want us to attend a ceremony next month." The table went silent. An Order of Merlin, a medal for heroism, a piece of metal to replace a sun. "I won't go," Ron said flatly. "Me neither," Ginny agreed. Percy said nothing, but his expression was tortured. The ministry was his world, had been his identity, and now it was offering honors to the brother he'd abandoned. "We don't have to decide now," Molly said quietly, though she already knew her answer. She would go, would accept the medal, would smile and shake hands and let them honor her son, because refusing felt like saying Fred's death meant nothing, and she couldn't bear that either. There were no good choices anymore, only less terrible ones. Later, when everyone had retreated to their rooms, Molly climbed the stairs, one last time. Bill had gone hours ago, but something in her needed to try again, to press her hand against that locked door and will it to open. She stopped on the landing. The door was ajar. Her heart leapt. She pushed it open carefully, afraid to hope, and found George standing at the window, his back to her. He was painfully thin, wearing clothes he'd had on for days. His hair, Ron's hair, Ginny's hair, all the Weasley children's red hair, was matted and tangled. "George," she breathed. He didn't turn, just kept staring out at the stars. "Bill sat out here for 3 hours," he said. His voice was hoarse, unused, talking about dragons, like I cared about dragons. He was trying. I know what he was trying. George's shoulders hunched. Everyone's trying. You're all trying so hard, and I can't give you what you need. I can't be okay. I can't move on. No one's asking you to move on, aren't you? He finally turned, and Molly's breath caught. He looked exactly like Fred, not similar, identical. But his eyes were empty in a way Fred's never were. Everyone's asking me to eat, to sleep, to come out of this room, to live. That's moving on. That's surviving. I don't want to survive without him. The words came out broken. I don't know how. We've always been. I don't know where I end, and he began. His face crumpled. Past tense. Everything's past tense now. Molly crossed the room and pulled her son into her arms. He resisted for a moment, then collapsed against her, sobbing in great, wrenching gasps that shook his whole body. She held him and rocked him and mourned with him, her tears mixing with his, and there were no words, no comfort, just the raw animal sound of a heart breaking. Outside, the moon rose. The stars wheeled overhead. The burrow creaked and settled. And in a room meant for two, a mother held her remaining son and learned that love wasn't enough to stop the hurting, but it was enough to make the hurting bearable. For one more night, at least. That would have to be enough. The morning George came down to breakfast, the world didn't change. Molly had imagined it would, in the small hours when sleep refused to come and hope felt like a dangerous thing to carry. She'd imagined trumpets, sunlight breaking through clouds, some cosmic acknowledgement that her son had taken a step back toward the living. But the sun rose the same as always, watery and hesitant through the kitchen window, and the clock still showed Fred's hand frozen in place, and grief still sat heavy in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed. But George was sitting at the table. That was something. That was everything. He looked terrible. His robes hung loose, his face was gaunt, and there were shadows under his eyes so dark they looked like bruises. But he was there, present, occupying space at the breakfast table for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Molly didn't say anything, didn't fuss or exclaim or weep with relief, though she wanted to do all three. Instead, she set a plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, bacon, the same breakfast she'd been making for 30 years, and poured him tea. George stared at the plate, as if he'd forgotten what food was. "You don't have to eat it all," she said quietly. "Just try." He picked up his fork, set it down, picked it up again, finally managed to lift a small bite of egg to his mouth. He chewed mechanically, swallowed, and Molly felt something in her chest unclench slightly. Small victories. That's what they were living on now. Arthur appeared in the doorway, froze when he saw George, then carefully took his seat, as if sudden movements might spook him. Ron followed minutes later, stopped so abruptly on the stairs that Molly heard him stumble, then entered the kitchen with studied casualness. "Morning," Ron said. George didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. That was something. They ate in silence, not the comfortable silence of before the battle, before Fred, before the world cracked open, but a fragile, tentative quiet, like they were all holding their breath, afraid to disturb whatever delicate balance had allowed George to leave his room. Ginny came in last, still in her nightdress, her hair a wild red tangle. She saw George and stopped, her eyes filling with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. She sat beside him without a word and reached for the marmalade, and the ordinariness of the gesture felt like grace. "I'm going to the ministry today," Percy announced into the quiet. He'd been doing that lately, making pronouncements about his schedule as if routine could ward off chaos. "Kingsley wants to discuss the new Muggle Protection Act. I'll be back for dinner." "All right, dear," Molly said. Percy nodded, pushed his eggs around his plate, and didn't eat them. None of them were eating much, except Ron, who ate everything put in front of him with the grim determination of someone who'd learned during the war that you ate when food was available because you never knew when it wouldn't be. The meal ended. Percy left for the ministry. Arthur retreated to his shed. Ginny disappeared upstairs. Ron lingered, clearly wanting to say something to George, but not knowing what, before finally giving up and slouching off to the sitting room. George remained at the table. Molly began clearing dishes, hyper-aware of him in her peripheral vision, afraid he might vanish like smoke if she looked directly at him. "Mum," he said. She turned, waited. "The shop." His voice was rough. "Someone needs to check on it. The stock, the everything. Your father's been maintaining the wards." "That's not what I mean." George stared at his hands. Hands that looked exactly like Fred's, moved like Fred's, existed in the world without Fred's to match them. "There are orders, customers. We were supposed to restock puking pastilles before summer, and the pygmy puffs need feeding, and someone has to—" He stopped, started again. "I can't go, but someone should." "I can go," Ron said from the doorway. Neither of them had heard him return. "If you want. I don't know how to run the shop or anything, but I can feed pygmy puffs and take inventory. Harry can help." George's jaw tightened. For a moment, Molly thought he'd refuse, would retreat back into himself and the safety of that locked room. But he nodded once, sharp and painful. "Don't move anything," he said. "Don't reorganize. Just keep things alive." "Yeah, okay, I can do that." It wasn't much, just a small delegation of responsibility, a tiny acknowledgement that the world beyond grief still existed. But watching her sons negotiate this fragile arrangement, Molly felt something that might have been hope, or might have been heartbreak, or might have been both at once. The days that followed developed a rhythm. George came down for meals, not every meal, but most. He sat at the table, picked at his food, occasionally responded to direct questions with monosyllables. He didn't talk about Fred, didn't talk about the shop, didn't talk about anything, really. But he was present, and presence was all Molly could ask for. Ron and Harry took over the shop. They apparated to Diagon Alley each morning and returned each evening with reports delivered carefully, as if handling explosives. The pygmy puffs were thriving. The inventory was mostly intact, though some skiving snack boxes had expired. Owls arrived daily with orders, condolences, questions about when they'd reopen. "There's a lot of people asking," Ron said one night over dinner, "wanting to know when." George's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully. "Tell them we're closed indefinitely." "Right, yeah, I'll tell them." But the seed had been planted. The shop existed. It needed tending. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, George began asking questions. Had they checked the decoy detonators for moisture damage? Were the extendable ears properly stored? Had anyone fed the fanged frisbees? Small questions, small concerns, small threads connecting him back to the world. Ginny spent her days in the orchard, practicing for Quidditch tryouts in the fall. She'd announced she was returning to Hogwarts to finish her 7th year, and no one had argued. They were all finding their own ways to survive, and Ginny's involved motion, violence channeled into something productive. She flew for hours, pushing her broom to dangerous speeds, emerging exhausted and centered. Percy worked obsessively at the ministry, arriving early and staying late, as if bureaucracy could absolve him. He came home with stories about new legislation, rebuilding efforts, the slow grinding machinery of government putting itself back together. No one really listened, but Percy seemed to need to tell them anyway, as if documenting normalcy could make it real. Arthur divided his time between his shed and the shop, helping Ron and Harry with the heavier lifting, the warding maintenance, the small repairs that accumulated when a building went untended. He worked with his hands because thinking hurt, and Molly understood. She cooked because cooking was what she'd always done, and if most of the food went uneaten, at least she'd made the effort. They were all making efforts, small, insufficient efforts that didn't fix anything but kept them upright. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 4 days after the battle. When it happened, they were at dinner, another mostly silent meal, forks scraping plates, the clock ticking, the ghost of Fred sitting in his empty chair. Molly had made shepherd's pie, one of Fred's favorites, and immediately regretted it when she saw George's face go pale. But he ate a few bites. Enough. Ron was talking, rambling really, about something that had happened at the shop. A customer had come in looking for love potion antidotes. Claimed his girlfriend dosed him, Ron said. Wanted to know if it was true love or magic, as if we'd know the difference. He stabbed at his peas. I told him if he had to ask, it probably wasn't love. Wise words, Arthur said dryly. Yeah, well, Hermione says. Ron stopped, blinked. Wait, I just gave relationship advice at Fred and George's shop. That's mental. He'd said it, Fred's name, out loud, casually, as if it were normal. The table went silent. Everyone froze, forks suspended, breath held. George stared at his plate, his knuckles white around his knife. I'm sorry, Ron said quickly. I didn't mean. It's fine, George said tonelessly. But it wasn't fine. The air was thick with the weight of the name, the acknowledgement, the slip into past tense that they'd all been carefully avoiding. Ron pushed back from the table. I'm an idiot. Sorry. I'm just going to. He gestured vaguely toward the stairs. Ron, George said. Ron stopped. Tell me the rest. About the customer. What? The customer. With the girlfriend. What happened? Ron sat back down slowly, suspiciously, as if expecting a trap. I told him we didn't carry antidotes. That if he wanted out of the relationship, he should just be honest with her. And he said. Ron's mouth twitched. He said, but she's scary when she's angry. What did you say? Ginny asked. I said, then you definitely shouldn't have gotten involved with someone you're afraid of. And he said. Ron's voice started to shake, though whether with tears or laughter Molly couldn't tell. He said, good point, and just left. Didn't buy anything. Just left. The corner of George's mouth moved. Not a smile, not even close, but something adjacent to humor, some recognition of the absurdity. We've got to start charging a consultation fee, George said quietly. And then Percy, of all people, said, Ronald Weasley, relationship counselor. I'm sure that'll end well. It wasn't funny. Not really. It was barely a joke, but something about Percy, serious, formal Percy, making a dry observation in that deadpan tone triggered something. Ron snorted, tried to hide it, failed. "Shut up," Ron said, but he was grinning. "You're one to talk. When was your last date?" "I date. Work dinners don't count. They're legitimate social, with people who actually like you." Percy's ears went red. "I have friends." "Name one who isn't a memo." Ginny choked on her pumpkin juice. Even Arthur's lips twitched. And George made a sound. A small sound, barely audible, somewhere between a cough and an exhale. But it was there, a crack in the wall, a hairline fracture in the grief. "I had friends," Percy said indignantly. "Penelope broke up with you years ago because you chose a cauldron regulation over her birthday," Ron said. "It was important legislation." "It was a cauldron." "Safety standards matter, Ronald." They were bickering, actually bickering. Ron and Percy, falling into the old patterns, the familiar rhythms of brothers who'd spent a lifetime getting under each other's skin. It was so normal. It was surreal. And George was watching them. His expression was still devastated, still hollow, but there was something else there too. Some small recognition that life was happening around him, absurd and persistent. "You're both idiots," Ginny said. "Rich, coming from you," Ron shot back. "Didn't you date Michael Corner?" "That was one time." "And then Dean Thomas." So your taste in men is questionable at best." Ginny threw a roll at Ron's head. He ducked, laughing, and it sailed past him, bouncing off the wall. Arthur retrieved it with his wand, looking torn between amusement and exasperation. "Children," Molly said, but there was no heat in it. They weren't children. They were war veterans, traumatized and grieving. But for this moment, this small, fragile moment, they were her children again, squabbling over nothing, alive and present and together. George pushed his chair back. They all froze, the laughter dying instantly, afraid they'd pushed too hard, said too much, broken whatever spell had allowed him to sit with them. But he didn't leave. He just stood there, gripping the back of his chair, his head bowed. "Fred would have had something to say," he said quietly, "about Percy's non-existent love life. Something terrible. Something that would have made us all laugh and Percy furious and Mum would have yelled and..." His voice cracked. He always had something to say. Always. And now there's just... He gestured at the empty chair. Nothing. The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, more honest. He would have said, Ron offered carefully, "At least I have a love life, Perce. Your cauldrons don't count." George's shoulders shook. For a terrifying moment, Molly thought he was crying. But when he looked up, his eyes were dry, and his mouth was curved in the smallest, most painful smile she'd ever seen. "Yeah," George whispered. "Yeah." He would have said that. It wasn't a laugh. It wasn't even close to a laugh. But it was acknowledgement, recognition. The tiniest step toward remembering Fred without being destroyed by the remembering. Percy stood abruptly. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "I should. I have work. Early meeting. I should..." He fled before anyone could respond, his footsteps thundering up the stairs. A door slammed overhead. "Should someone..." Ginny started. "Let him go," Arthur said quietly. "He needs to process in his own way." George sank back into his chair. He looked exhausted, wrung out, as if those few words had cost him everything. Molly wanted to go to him, to hold him. But she sensed he needed space, needed to sit with whatever he was feeling without being smothered by care. "The shop," George said after a long moment. "How bad is it really?" Ron exchanged a glance with Arthur. "It's manageable, but it needs someone who knows what they're doing. I can feed pygmy puffs, but I can't run a business." "I know. I'm not saying you have to." "I know," George repeated. I'm asking, that's all. Just asking." It was more than asking. It was the first indication that George was thinking about a future, even if that future was terrifying and uncertain and empty of the person who'd made it meaningful. Molly cleared the plates with careful, quiet movements. The bickering had stopped, but the air felt different. Lighter, maybe. Or perhaps just less suffocatingly heavy. Progress came in degrees so small they were almost imperceptible, but they were there. That night, as Molly lay beside Arthur in their bed, listening to the house settle around them, she heard it, faint, from down the hall, the sound of George's door opening, footsteps in the hallway, a pause outside Percy's door, a quiet knock. She held her breath. "It's me," George said, muffled by the wall between them. Can we talk?" A long pause. Then Percy's door opened. Molly couldn't hear what they said. The words were too soft, too private. But the conversation went on for a long time, and when George finally returned to his room, Molly heard something she hadn't heard in weeks. The sound of 2 doors closing instead of locking. It wasn't laughter, it wasn't healing, but it was something. A small crack in the darkness, a possibility that maybe, eventually, impossibly, they might find a way to survive this. Arthur reached for her hand in the darkness. She took it, and they lay together, listening to their children breathe in their separate rooms, grateful for each breath, each heartbeat, each small moment of being alive. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead. The moon set. Dawn would come, as it always did, indifferent to suffering. But for the first time since Fred died, Molly thought she might be able to face it. The decision to reopen Weasley's Wizard Wheezes wasn't made in a single moment. It accumulated over days like sediment, small conversations layering into something that might have been resolve or might have been desperation. George didn't announce it, didn't gather the family for a declaration. He simply started asking more questions about the shop. Detailed, specific questions that required Ron to take notes because he couldn't remember which products went on, which shelves, or how the register enchantments worked. "The portable swamp," George said one morning at breakfast. "Did you check the containment charms?" Ron blinked at him over his toast. "The what?" "Portable swamp. We keep 6 units in the back room. They need maintenance every 4 weeks, or they start growing moss in the chore packaging." "Right. Yeah. I'll check that." "And the decoy detonators. They're temperature sensitive. If the shop's been too warm—" "George," Arthur interrupted gently. "Do you want to go to the shop to check these things yourself?" George's jaw tightened. His hands curled around his teacup, knuckles whitening. For a long moment, he didn't speak, and Molly thought he might retreat, might disappear back into that room and lock the door again. But he said, "Yes." Just that. One word. Yes. They went together, George, Ron, and Arthur. Molly watched them disapparate from the garden with her heart in her throat, afraid of what going back would do to George, afraid of him seeing the shop without Fred, afraid of everything and unable to stop any of it. Ginny found her standing at the window an hour later, still staring at the empty space where they'd vanished. He'll be all right, Ginny said, though her voice lacked conviction. Will he? He has to be. We all have to be. Ginny crossed to the sink, filled a glass with water, drank it in mechanical gulps. She'd come in from the orchard, sweaty and grass-stained, her hair plastered to her forehead. I got a letter from Gwenog Jones. Molly turned. The Harpies, Captain. She wants me to try out. After I finish at Hogwarts. Ginny set the glass down with too much force. Professional Quidditch. It's what I've always wanted. That's wonderful, dear. Is it? Ginny's voice went sharp. Fred's dead and I'm getting Quidditch offers. George can barely function and I'm thinking about tryouts. What kind of person does that make me? Human, Molly said softly. It makes you human. It makes me selfish. No. Molly crossed to her daughter, cupped her face between her hands. It makes you alive. And Fred would hex you himself if you gave up Quidditch because of him. You know he would. Ginny's eyes filled with tears. He'd make some terrible joke about it. Say I was too rubbish to get in anyway. Exactly. I miss him. The words came out broken. I miss him so much. And I feel guilty for wanting things, for being excited about anything, like I don't have permission to be happy when he's gone. Molly pulled Ginny into her arms, held her while she cried the way she hadn't let herself cry in weeks. Her fierce, brave girl who'd fought in the battle, who'd lost a brother, who was 17 and shouldn't have had to carry any of this weight. You have permission, Molly whispered into her hair. You have all the permission in the world. Live for him. Live because you can and he can't. That's not betrayal. That's love. Ginny sobbed harder, and Molly held her. And outside the window, the garden continued its work of growing, indifferent and persistent. When George returned that evening, he looked gutted. He came through the door, pale and shaking, went straight upstairs without speaking, and locked himself in his room for 2 hours. Molly paced the kitchen, kneading bread dough with vicious efficiency, taking her fear out on the flour and yeast. Ron and Arthur sat at the table, exhausted. How bad was it? Molly asked. Bad, Ron said quietly. Everything's how they left it. There's half-finished inventory in the workshop. Fred's notes everywhere. His handwriting. Ron's voice cracked. His mug was still on the desk. Coffee gone mouldy in the bottom. George just stood there staring at it. Arthur rubbed his face. He walked through the whole shop. Touched everything. The displays, the products, the walls. Like he was memorizing it. Or saying goodbye. Is he going to sell it? Molly's hands stilled in the dough. I don't know. He didn't say. He looked at everything and then asked us to leave him alone for a bit. We waited outside. When he came out, he locked up and said we should go home. Molly's heart clenched. She'd been afraid of this. Afraid the shop would be too much, that George would decide to let it go, to close that chapter of his life because keeping it open was unbearable. But 2 hours later, George emerged from his room. He came down the stairs slowly, his expression set with something that might have been determination or might have been resignation. He sat at the kitchen table where Molly had been shaping rolls and said, I'm going to reopen. The words hung in the air. Ron's head snapped up. Arthur went very still. George, Molly started carefully. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I'm going to. His voice was flat, toneless. The shop was ours, Fred's and mine. Everything in there. We built it together. Every product, every display, every stupid joke. It's all him. It's all us. He swallowed hard. If I close it, it's like saying he didn't matter, that what we made didn't matter, and I can't. I won't do that. No one would think. I would think it. George's eyes met hers, and they were devastated but determined. I can't bring him back. I can't fix this, but I can keep the shop alive. I can make sure what we built doesn't die with him. Molly wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he didn't owe Fred anything, that taking care of himself was more important than maintaining a business. But she saw in his face that the shop wasn't about obligation. It was about survival. This was how George was choosing to keep going, by building something instead of drowning in what was lost. "What do you need?" Arthur asked quietly. George took a breath, released it. "Help. I can't do it alone. I need Ron, if you're willing. And maybe..." He hesitated. Maybe Lee Jordan, if he'd come back. He was always good with customers. "I'm in," Ron said immediately. "Obviously, whatever you need. And I'll help with the accounting." Percy's voice came from the doorway. He stood there in his ministry robes, having just arrived home, his expression careful. "If you want, I'm good with numbers, organization, that sort of thing." George stared at him. Percy stared back. The weight of their fractured history, years of estrangement, angry words, Percy's absence from their lives hung between them. "Why?" George asked. "Because you're my brother." Percy's voice was steady. "Because I failed you before, failed all of you. And I can't fix that, but I can show up now, if you'll let me." The silence stretched. George's throat worked. For a terrible moment, Molly thought he might refuse, might throw Percy's offer back in his face, along with all the hurt Percy had caused. But George nodded. Once. Sharp. "Okay." Percy's shoulders sagged with relief. "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a door opened, a possibility extended, and that was more than Molly had dared hope for. The next week was a blur of activity. George threw himself into preparations with an intensity that was alarming in its focus. He made lists, pages and pages of lists, detailing every task that needed completing before the shop could reopen. Inventory to sort, displays to update, products to test, staff to hire, marketing to plan. Ron worked alongside him, taking orders, learning the products, slowly understanding the complex ecosystem Fred and George had built. Harry joined them most days, helping with heavy lifting and offering quiet support. The three of them would apparate to Diagon Alley each morning and return each night exhausted, covered in dust and spell residue, smelling of dung bombs and sugar quills. Percy came by after work, staying late into the night, sorting through accounts, organizing receipts, building filing systems that made George's eye twitch but worked efficiently. They didn't talk much, Percy and George, but they existed in the same space, working toward the same goal, and that was something. Lee Jordan arrived on a Wednesday. Molly was in the kitchen when the flue flared green, and Lee stumbled through, dreadlocks singed, carrying a battered rucksack. He saw Molly and froze. "Mrs. Weasley, I'm so sorry. About Fred. I should have come sooner. I should have been at the funeral. His voice broke. "I couldn't face it. I'm sorry." Molly pulled him into a hug. Lee had been at Hogwarts with the twins, had been their partner in mischief, had started the shop with them before going off to pursue his radio career. He was practically family. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." "Is George? Can I see him?" "He's at the shop, in Diagon Alley." Lee nodded, wiped his eyes, and disapparated without another word. When they all returned that evening, Lee was with them. He and George sat slightly apart from the others, not quite touching but orbiting each other like binary stars. Lee's eyes were red. George's jaw was tight. But they were together, and that was enough. "He's staying," George announced at dinner. "Lee, he's coming back to help run the shop." "That's wonderful," Molly said. Lee managed a weak smile. "Someone has to keep him from burning the place down with experimental wildfire whiz-bangs." "That was one time," George muttered. "It was 3 times. 2.5. You can't have half a fire, George." The corner of George's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Lee saw it, and something in his expression eased. They were finding a rhythm, Molly realized. Building something new from the wreckage. It wasn't the same as before, could never be the same, but it was functional, purposeful, a reason to get up in the morning. A week before the planned reopening, George came home carrying a large roll of parchment. He spread it on the kitchen table, and Molly saw it was a detailed sketch, architectural plans for the shop's interior. But there was something new. In the back corner, George had drawn what looked like a small memorial space. "I want to do this," he said, pointing. "A wall. For Fred. For customers to leave notes, memories, tributes, whatever they want. He touched so many people's lives, made them laugh. I want to honor that." "George," Molly whispered, her eyes filling. "That's beautiful." "Is it?" His voice was uncertain. "Or is it morbid? I can't tell anymore. I can't tell what's normal grief and what's—" He gestured helplessly. "I don't know how to do this. Any of this." "None of us do," Arthur said. "We're all just making it up as we go." "He'd hate it," George said suddenly. "Fred would hate having a memorial wall. He'd say it was too serious, too maudlin. He'd want—" George stopped, swallowed. "I don't know what he'd want. I should know. We knew everything about each other, but I don't know what he'd want for this." Ron leaned forward. "He'd want people to remember him, not the dead war hero version, the real Fred, the one who put dung bombs in Umbridge's office, who gave Montague a nosebleed nougat before his OWLS, who made kids laugh when everything was terrible." "He'd want magic," Ginny added. "Not just a wall with notes, something that moves, something alive." George looked at his sketch, at the empty space he'd designated for his brother's memory. Slowly, his hand reached for his wand. He tapped the parchment, and the drawing shifted, changed. The wall became something else. A living canvas that showed moving images, swirling colors, enchanted to capture moments of joy. "Like a pensive," George said slowly, "but for laughter." People could leave memories of times Fred made them happy, and the wall would show them, moving, living memories. "He'd love that," Molly said through tears. "He'd absolutely love that." George stared at his creation. "I have no idea how to make it work." "We'll figure it out," Percy said. He'd been standing in the doorway, watching. Now he approached the table, studying the sketch with his analytical gaze. "There are charms for memory preservation, spells for emotional resonance, if we combine them with standard enchantment theory." "You'd help with that?" George asked. "If you want me to." George nodded. Yeah, I do." Percy pulled out a chair and sat. Ron shifted closer. Arthur retrieved his reading glasses. Lee appeared from the sitting room where he'd been dozing. They bent over the parchment together, planning, discussing, arguing gently about magical theory and practical application. Molly watched her sons, 5 of them, where there should have been 6, worked together on something beautiful, something that would honor the missing piece of their family. She thought about how grief could be transmuted into creation, how love didn't end with death but found new expressions, new forms. Ginny touched her arm. "You should make the first contribution. To the wall." "What?" "You're his mum. You should be the first to leave a memory of Fred." Molly's throat closed. She thought of Fred, her son, her bright, beautiful, impossible son, and tried to choose just one memory from thousands. Fred as a baby, laughing at his own toes. Fred at 5, trying to teach Ron to fly on a toy broom. Fred at 11, getting sorted into Gryffindor and whooping so loud the ceiling echoed. Fred at 17, opening the shop with George, his face alight with dreams. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "You can," Ginny said. "When you're ready. There's no rush." But there was, Molly thought. There was a terrible rush. Every day the memories faded a little. Every day Fred's voice in her head grew quieter. She needed to capture something before it slipped away entirely, before grief eroded the edges of remembering and left only the ache of absence. That night, she sat at her desk and took out a fresh piece of parchment. She picked up her quill, set it down, picked it up again, and she began to write. Not everything, not even most things. Just one small moment, one perfect sliver of memory. Fred at 7, in the orchard, catching a garden gnome and declaring it the new king of the Burrow. He built it a throne from twigs and held a coronation ceremony where he sang "God Save the Gnome" until we were all crying with laughter. Arthur finally convinced him to let it go. The gnome bit Fred's finger and ran off. Fred declared it an assassination attempt and vowed revenge. He never did get his revenge. He just loved that gnome, loved making us laugh, loved being ridiculous and bright and alive. She folded the memory, sealed it with a charm, and gave it to George the next morning. He took it without speaking, held it against his chest, and nodded. The shop was almost ready. The memorial wall waited for its first offering. And slowly, impossibly, the Weasleys were learning to build something from the ruins. September arrived, with the particular cruelty of beautiful weather. The sky was impossibly blue, the air crisp with the promise of autumn, and the Burrow's garden exploded with late summer blooms, hollyhocks and dahlias and roses that didn't know they should be mourning. Molly stood among them, secateurs in hand, unable to bring herself to cut a single stem. Fred had loved the garden in September, had declared it the best month, when everything was abundant, but tinged with ending, when the light turned golden and the air smelled of apples and wood smoke. Now September was here, and Fred wasn't. The reopening of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes had been set for the first Saturday of the month. The family had thrown themselves into preparations with determined intensity, anything to avoid thinking about the other thing September meant, the thing they were all carefully not discussing. Ginny was leaving for Hogwarts. She'd return to complete her 7th year, the year that had been stolen by Carrows and fear and war. McGonagall had sent letters to all the students whose education had been disrupted, inviting them back, offering them a chance to reclaim something of normalcy. Hermione had accepted immediately, already making study schedules and reading lists. Harry had declined. The boy who lived had decided he was done with formal education, wanted only to train as an aura and try to build a life. Ron was torn. Molly knew he was torn. could see it in the way he looked at Hermione's letters, the way he hesitated when people asked about his plans. Part of him wanted to return with Hermione, to finish what he'd started. Part of him couldn't bear the thought of going back to that castle where he'd fought, where he'd lost Fred, where every stone held memories of before. And then there was the shop. George needed him. That tipped the scales. But Ginny was going, and the house would be even emptier. Molly cut a single rose, blood red and perfect, and brought it inside. She placed it in a vase on the kitchen table, where it blazed like a wound against the scarred wood. The trunks appeared in the hallway 2 days before the Hogwarts Express was set to depart. Ginny's school trunk, battered and covered in Harpy stickers, and beside it, unexpectedly, Hermione's. She'd been staying at the Burrow more and more, the Granger house still feeling wrong somehow, her parents still piecing back together memories that Hermione had fractured trying to save them. Molly found the girls in Ginny's room, sorting through school supplies with the kind of focused attention that suggested they were avoiding a more difficult conversation. "Need any help?" Molly asked from the doorway. "We're all right, Mrs. Weasley," Hermione said. She was folding robes with precise, neat movements. Always so controlled, Hermione, always holding herself together through sheer force of will. "I can't find my potions textbook," Ginny said, digging through a pile of books. "I think Ron borrowed it to identify something at the shop and never gave it back. I'll ask him." Molly hesitated in the doorway. How are you feeling about going back?" Ginny stopped searching and sat back on her heels, terrified, excited, guilty for being excited. The usual. "It's all right to be excited." "Is it?" Ginny's voice went sharp. "Fred's dead. George can barely function. And I'm thinking about Quidditch tryouts and NEWTS and whether Dean Thomas will be weird around me in the corridors. What kind of person does that make me?" "A 17-year-old, Molly said gently. "You're allowed to have a life, Ginny. You're allowed to want things. It feels selfish." "It's not selfish. It's surviving." Hermione set down the robes she'd been folding. "I keep thinking about that too. About going back to the library, taking notes, studying for exams like they matter. Like any of it matters when—" She stopped, started again. "I spent a year on the run, nearly died more times than I can count, watched people I cared about get hurt, tortured, and now I'm supposed to go back and write essays about transfiguration theory." "Yes," Molly said firmly, "because the world didn't end. As much as it feels like it did, it didn't. And you two, you're so young. You have so much life ahead of you. You can't let grief trap you. You can't stop moving forward just because others can't anymore." Ginny's eyes filled with tears. "I miss him, Mum. I know, darling, I know. And I'm scared that going to Hogwarts means leaving him behind, like he'll fade if I'm not here thinking about him every second." Molly crossed the room and pulled her daughter into her arms. "He won't fade. He's written into you, into all of us. You can't leave him behind even if you tried." Ginny sobbed against her shoulder, and Hermione quietly left the room, giving them privacy. Mother and daughter held each other while the afternoon light slanted through the window, and the packed trunks waited by the door, and the world kept insisting on its forward momentum. That night, the family gathered for dinner, the last dinner before Ginny left. Molly had cooked everything Ginny loved: roast chicken, roasted potatoes with rosemary, honey-glazed carrots, treacle tart for dessert. The table groaned under the weight of food that no one would eat enough of. But Molly needed to cook, needed to provide, needed to give her daughter something tangible to remember. George came down without being called, which was still novel enough to feel like a small miracle. He'd been spending most of his time at the shop, working himself to exhaustion, coming home to collapse into bed and rise before dawn to do it again. The reopening was the morrow, and he looked hollowed out with stress and grief and determination. Lee Jordan was there too, having essentially moved into Bill's old room. He and George had fallen into an easy partnership, finishing each other's sentences, communicating in half words and gestures the way George used to do with Fred. It wasn't the same, could never be the same, but it was functional. Percy arrived late, still in ministry robes, carrying a wrapped package that he set beside Ginny's plate with awkward formality. "What's this?" Ginny asked. "Early birthday present, since I'll be working when your actual birthday comes around." Ginny unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal, expensive and beautiful, with her initials embossed in gold on the cover. "Percy, this is for writing. You used to write before." Percy adjusted his glasses. "I thought you might want to again, to document things. Your last year at Hogwarts, whatever you want." Ginny stared at the journal, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "Thank you. This is really thoughtful." Percy's ears went red. "Yes, well, you're my sister. I thought—" He sat down abruptly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Ron grinned. "Careful, Ginny. Percy being thoughtful, that's a sign of the apocalypse." "Shut up, Ronald. Make me, Weatherby." They bickered, and it was so normal, so much like before, that Molly's chest ached with the familiarity. Arthur served the chicken, carving it with the same careful attention he gave his muggle artifacts. Harry helped pass plates. Hermione poured pumpkin juice. They moved around each other with practiced ease, filling the spaces, covering the gaps, except for one gap, one space that couldn't be filled. "I have something to say," George announced suddenly. The table went quiet. George rarely spoke during meals, usually just pushed food around his plate and answered direct questions with monosyllables. Now he set down his fork and looked at Ginny. "You're going back to Hogwarts," he said. "And you should. You need to. But I want you to know." He stopped, swallowed hard. "Fred would be proud of you. For going back. For not letting what happened break you. He'd probably give you some terrible advice about pranking teachers or smuggling dung bombs into the castle. But mostly, he'd just be proud." Ginny's eyes filled. "George, I'm not good at this. Talking, being—" He gestured helplessly. "But I needed to say it, before you left, that Fred would want you to live, to fly, to be brilliant, and so do I." The words settled over the table like a benediction. Molly saw Ron wipe his eyes quickly. Arthur's jaw was tight. Even Percy looked affected, his usual composure cracking. "Thank you," Ginny whispered. George nodded once and returned to his meal. The moment of vulnerability closed. But the words lingered, precious and rare. They ate. The food was good. Molly had made sure it was good. But everyone's appetite was minimal. Still, they tried, made the effort, passed dishes and refilled glasses, and maintained the fiction that this was just another family dinner, not a goodbye. After the meal, after the treacle tart had been picked at and the dishes cleared, they sat in the sitting room. It wasn't planned. They simply migrated there, settling into familiar spots. Arthur in his chair, Molly on the sofa. The children sprawled across various surfaces. "Tell us about your first day at Hogwarts," Harry said to Ginny. "Your real first day. What was it like?" Ginny smiled. "Terrifying. I was so nervous I could barely eat breakfast. Mum cried on the platform." "I did not cry," Molly protested. "You absolutely cried, and Ron told me to avoid Slytherins like they were contagious." "They basically are," Ron muttered. "And Fred," Ginny's voice caught. "Fred and George found me on the train. They were third years, acting like they owned the place. Fred told me the sorting hat was actually a hat that read your mind and announced your deepest secrets to the whole school." Lee laughed. "I remember that. You believed it too." "I was 11 and terrified." Ginny's smile was watery but genuine. "I spent the whole feast worrying the hat would announce I had a crush on Harry Potter." Harry went scarlet. Everyone laughed, and the sound was rusty but real. "Fred was good at that," George said quietly. "Making people feel better, making fear feel smaller. He'd lie to you, tell you the most ridiculous things, and somehow it helped. Remember when he told the first years that the suits of armor came alive at midnight?" Ron said. "And that the giant squid in the lake was vegetarian, but might mistake students for kelp? And that Dumbledore's beard was actually a very polite niffler?" The stories came out, one after another, memories tumbling free. Not the sanitized, reverent memories of the dead, but the real ones. Fred being ridiculous, Fred pranking people, Fred getting detention, Fred being gloriously, messily alive. Molly listened to her children trade stories about their brother, and it hurt. God, it hurt. But it was also necessary. This was how they kept him alive, not by building monuments or maintaining perfect silence, but by remembering him honestly, completely, with all his terrible jokes and brilliant schemes and enormous heart. Percy's voice joined the others, hesitant at first, then stronger. He'd missed years of Fred's life, but he had older memories, childhood stories that made George lean forward with surprise and recognition. "I'd forgotten that," George said at one point, wonder in his voice. "How do you remember that?" "I remember all of it," Percy said quietly. "Every moment I missed, every time I should have been there and wasn't. I remember it all." The room went quiet. Then George said, "Tell us more." So Percy did, and the stories continued, weaving Fred into the present through remembering, making him part of the evening even in absence. The next morning, Molly woke early to make breakfast before the train. The house was still quiet, dawn just breaking over the orchard. She moved through the kitchen in familiar patterns, cracking eggs, frying bacon, toasting bread. The work soothed her, gave her hands something to do besides shake. Today, George reopened the shop. Today, Ginny left for Hogwarts. 2 monumental changes on the same day, and Molly felt stretched between them, unable to fully focus on either. Footsteps on the stairs. Arthur appeared, already dressed, looking as exhausted as she felt. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Didn't try. You?" "Same." They moved around each other in the comfortable silence of 3 decades of marriage. Arthur made tea. Molly plated breakfast. The rhythm was soothing, familiar, a small island of normalcy in the chaos. One by one, the others appeared. Ginny, already in her school robes. Hermione, organized and composed. Ron, bleary and disheveled. Harry, quiet and supportive. George, in the purple robes he'd chosen for the shop reopening. Fred's color. Fred's choice. Percy, taking the morning off work to see Ginny off. They ate together, this assembled family of survivors, and no one mentioned that this was the last morning they'd all be together for months. No one acknowledged the empty chair, though they all felt it. After breakfast, they gathered in the garden to apparate. Ginny's trunk was feather-light with magic. Her owl, Arnold, hooted irritably in his cage. Molly pulled her daughter aside for a private moment before they left. "I'm proud of you," she said, cupping Ginny's face. "So proud for being brave enough to go back, for choosing life even when it's hard." "I'm scared, Mum." "I know. That's what makes it brave." They held each other, and Molly breathed in the scent of her daughter, broom polish and grass and home, and tried not to think about how the house would feel without her. "Write to me," Molly said. "Tell me everything." "I will, I promise." "And Ginny?" "Yeah? Fred's not the only one who would be proud. I'm proud too. Your father's proud. We're all so proud of you." Ginny nodded, tears streaming down her face. And then Arthur was calling that it was time, and they were disapparat, ing to King's Cross, and the morning was moving too fast, spinning toward goodbyes that Molly wasn't ready for. But ready or not, they came. King's Cross was chaos. Platform 9 3/4 was packed with students and parents, owls hooting, cats yowling, trunks being loaded onto the Scarlet engine. The Hogwarts Express sat waiting, smoke billowing from its chimney, the same as it had been for over a century. Wars came and went, people lived and died, but the train still departed on September 1st, still carried children to school, still insisted that life continued. Ginny found Hermione in the crowd. They hugged their parents, made promises to write, and disappeared into the train with their trunks. Through the window, Molly could see them finding a compartment, settling in, already slipping back into the rhythms of student life. The whistle blew. The train lurched forward. Parents waved, students waved back, and the platform slowly emptied as the train disappeared around the bend. Molly stood with Arthur's arm around her, watching until there was nothing left to see. "She'll be all right," Arthur said. "I know. She's strong. They all are. I know." But knowing didn't make the empty house any easier to face. They apparated back to the Burrow, Arthur, Molly, and Percy. The kitchen felt cavernous. Molly looked at the clock. All the hands pointed to travelling except Fred's, which remained fixed in its terrible stillness. 7 children, 4 still at home, 3 missing, Charlie in Romania, Bill at Shell Cottage, Ginny at Hogwarts, and one who would never come home again. The silence pressed in. Arthur excused himself to the shed. Percy left for the ministry, and Molly stood alone in the kitchen that had once been the chaotic heart of their family, and learned what emptiness really meant. But there was bread to bake, laundry to fold, a garden to tend. So she did those things, one task, then another, filling the hours until George and Ron and Lee returned from the shop, until the house had people in it again, until the emptiness felt slightly less vast. Outside, the September sun blazed golden and beautiful. Inside, Molly kept moving forward. Because that's what you did. You survived. Even when surviving felt like the loneliest thing in the world. December arrived with snow and silence. The Burrow wore winter like a threadbare blanket. The garden buried under white, icicles hanging from the eaves like frozen tears. The pond glazed over with ice thick enough to walk on. Inside, Molly kept the fires burning with an intensity that bordered on obsession. the house would be warm. If she could control nothing else, she could control that. It would be their first Christmas without Fred. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, growing heavier as the calendar pages turned. November had been difficult. George's birthday on the 1st, the same day as Fred's would have been. They'd tried to ignore it, but ignoring a birthday only made it more present, more painfully obvious in its absence. George had worked through the entire day, staying at the shop until nearly midnight, coming home exhausted enough that thinking was impossible. But Christmas couldn't be ignored. Christmas was loud and insistent, demanding acknowledgement. Already the shops in Diagon Alley were festooned with enchanted garlands. Celestina Warbeck crooned carols on the wireless. Owls delivered cards from well-meaning friends who signed them with phrases like, "Thinking of you in this difficult season," as if sentiment could fill the Fred-shaped hole in their family. Molly had told herself she wouldn't decorate, couldn't decorate. How could she hang stockings when one would remain empty? How could she string lights and pretend joy when her son was in the ground? But 3 weeks before Christmas, Ginny came home for the holidays, and everything changed. The flu flared green, and Ginny tumbled through, trunk first, covered in soot and grinning. "I'm home," she announced, and the word home made Molly's chest tight. She looked good, better than she had in September. There was colour in her cheeks, brightness in her eyes. Hogwarts had been good for her, Molly realised. The distance, the routine, the reminder that life existed beyond grief. "How was term?" Molly asked, pulling her into a fierce hug. "Exhausting, brilliant, strange." Ginny pulled back, studying her mother's face. "You look tired." "I'm fine, Mum. I'm fine," Molly repeated firmly. "Tell me about school. How are your NEWTS classes?" Ginny let it drop, launching into stories about potions disasters and transfiguration breakthroughs, and the new Quidditch captain who was running them ragged with practices. She talked about Hermione's obsessive study schedules, about Luna's latest strange beliefs, about Neville, who was apparently now terrifyingly competent at herbology and being courted by several universities for advanced study. She didn't mention the parts that were hard, didn't talk about walking past the place where Fred died, or sitting in the great hall where they'd laid out the bodies, or the way certain corridors still smelled like smoke and dark magic. But Molly saw it in the shadows behind her eyes, the moments when Ginny's brightness flickered. They'd all learned to perform normalcy, to smile and chat and pretend the world wasn't fundamentally broken. It was exhausting, but it was survival. Ron came home an hour later, having closed the shop early to see Ginny. He swept her into a hug that lifted her off her feet, and they bickered immediately about Quidditch standings and whether the Harpies or the Cannons had a better chance at the cup. The familiar rhythm of sibling antagonism filled the kitchen, and Molly felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. George appeared last, having stayed behind to finish inventory. He looked better than he had in September, less gaunt, more present. But there was still something hollow in his expression, something that suggested he was performing the motions of living without fully inhabiting them. "Ginny B," he said, using the old nickname. "George." She crossed to him, and they hugged carefully, like two people made of glass trying not to shatter. "Shop's doing well." "Well enough. We hired 2 new employees. Lee's been brilliant with the customers. Percy's actually useful for once." "I heard that," Percy called from the sitting room. where he'd been reading. "You were meant to," George called back, but there was no heat in it. He and Percy had achieved something like détente over the past months. Not quite forgiveness, but functional collaboration. Small steps. That night at dinner, the first meal with all of them together since September, Ginny brought up Christmas. "We're decorating this year, right?" The table went silent. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Everyone looked at Molly. "I don't know," Molly said carefully. "I thought perhaps—" "We have to," Ginny interrupted. "We can't just pretend Christmas isn't happening." "We're not pretending," Arthur said gently. "We're just acknowledging that it's difficult." "Everything's difficult," Ginny said. Her voice had gone sharp. "Living is difficult. Getting up in the morning is difficult. But we're doing it anyway. Why should Christmas be different?" "Ginny," George started. "No." She looked around the table, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had led her into the Battle of Hogwarts at 16. Fred loved Christmas. Loved it. Remember how he'd wake everyone up at dawn, how he and George would enchant the decorations to sing off-key carols, how he'd give the most ridiculous gifts and be so pleased with himself. That's exactly why. Molly's voice cracked. "That's why it's so hard. Because he's not here. Because every tradition will remind us." "Good," Ginny said fiercely. "Let it remind us. Let us remember him. Isn't that better than pretending he never existed?" The words hung in the air, challenging and raw. George pushed back from the table. For a moment, Molly thought he'd leave, retreat to his room, or the shop, or anywhere but this conversation. But he stood there, gripping the back of his chair, his knuckles white. "She's right," he said finally. "Ginny's right. We can't—" He stopped, breathed. "I've spent 6 months trying not to think about him, working myself to exhaustion so I wouldn't have to remember. And it doesn't work. He's there anyway, in everything, every product in the shop, every corner of that building, every—" His voice broke. "If I'm going to remember anyway, maybe Ginny's right. Maybe we should do it on purpose. Choose to remember the good parts instead of just drowning in the absence." Molly looked at her son, her living son, her surviving son, and saw something in his face she hadn't seen in months. Not quite hope, but determination, a choice to engage with grief instead of hiding from it. "All right," she heard herself say. "All right, we'll do Christmas." The next day, they dragged the decorations down from the attic. The boxes were dusty, labeled in Molly's careful handwriting from years ago. Ornaments, fragile. Garland, green. Lights, test before hanging. Evidence of happier Christmases, when the biggest concern was whether the enchantments would hold, or if the gnomes would eat the outdoor decorations again. They worked together, stringing lights that sparkled with color-changing charms, hanging garland that released the scent of pine and cinnamon, setting up the tree that Arthur had cut from the orchard, a slightly crooked fir that leaned optimistically to the left. Ginny put on the wireless, filling the house with carols. Ron grumbled about the music, but sang along anyway, off-key and enthusiastic. Percy organized ornaments by size and color scheme, which George immediately sabotaged by hanging them randomly. Harry showed up unannounced and was immediately pressed into service, hanging the higher decorations. "You're the tallest," Ron declared, "and you can fly. That's practically cheating." "I'm not flying to hang Christmas ornaments. Coward." They bickered and laughed and worked, and slowly the burrow transformed into something that looked almost festive, almost normal. Molly opened a box labeled stockings and stopped. Inside were 8 stockings, hand-knitted in various sizes. Each one had a name stitched across the top in Molly's careful embroidery. Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, George, Ron, Ginny, and one additional one, added more recently, Harry. She lifted Fred's stocking out carefully, red and gold, Gryffindor colours, with a small golden snitch she'd embroidered in one corner because Fred had loved Quidditch, even though he'd never made the house team. "Mum?" George's voice was quiet. He'd come up beside her without her noticing. "I don't know if I can hang it," she whispered. "His stocking, it'll be empty. I don't know if I can look at it empty." George took the stocking from her hands. He held it for a long moment, running his thumb over the stitched name. Then he said, "We fill it." "What?" "We fill it. Everyone writes something, a memory, a wish, something they want to say to Fred. We put them in the stocking, so it's not empty, so he's still part of Christmas." Molly's eyes filled. "George, that's mental, probably. But so was Fred." George's smile was painful. "Come on, let's hang them all." So they did. All 8 stockings in a row above the fireplace. And Fred's didn't look empty anymore, because it wouldn't be empty. It would be full of love and memory and the things left unsaid. The days before Christmas spun out with surprising activity. Bill and Fleur arrived, bringing Victoire, who was barely walking, and enchanted by everything. The tree, the lights, the garden gnomes who eyed her with suspicious interest. Charlie sent a package from Romania containing dragon hide gloves for everyone, and a note saying he couldn't make it home, but was thinking of them. Hermione came and went, splitting time between the Burrow and her parents, trying to rebuild bridges that memory charms had damaged. The kitchen was constantly full. Molly cooked with determined intensity, mince pies, Christmas pudding, roast goose for Christmas dinner, shortbread biscuits that she shaped like stars and bells. The work kept her hands busy, kept her mind occupied, kept the grief at bay long enough to function. On Christmas Eve, Lee Jordan arrived, carrying a large mysterious package. "What's that?" George asked. "You'll see." Lee looked pleased with himself. "Everyone needs to gather in the sitting room. This is important." They assembled, all of them, even Percy, who'd been working on ministry reports, and Lee set the package down with ceremony. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a shallow basin filled with what looked like liquid silver, swirling with rainbow colors. "Is that a pensieve?" Hermione asked. "Modified pensieve," Lee corrected. "I've been working on it for weeks. George had the idea, the memory wall at the shop. I wanted to make something similar for here, for Christmas." He looked at George. "If that's okay." George stared at the basin, his throat working. "Lee?" "It's not just for looking at memories," Lee continued. "It's for sharing them. Everyone contributes a memory of Fred, your favorite memory, the one that makes you smile, and the pensieve weaves them together, shows them all at once. A celebration, instead of a wake." The room was silent. Then Ginny said, "That's brilliant." "It's something," Lee said. He looked nervous suddenly. "I know it's not. I know nothing can fix this. But I thought maybe—" "It's perfect," Molly said, her voice thick. "Thank you, Lee." Lee nodded, clearly relieved. "So, who wants to go first?" They took turns, each person touching their wand to their temple, drawing out a silvery strand of memory and depositing it into the basin. The memories swirled together, mixing and melding, creating something that was part remembrance, part tribute, part love letter to the missing. When everyone had contributed, Lee activated the pensive with a complex wand movement. The sitting room filled with silvery light, and suddenly Fred was there. Not solid, not real, but present. A collection of moments, playing out simultaneously. Fred at 7, at 12, at 17, at 20. Fred laughing, joking, pulling pranks, hugging his siblings, kissing his mother's cheek, working in the shop, flying on a broom, shouting, "Weasley is our king," at a Quidditch match, setting off fireworks in the Hogwarts corridor, telling a joke with his face alight with mischief. The Fred they remembered. Not the Fred who died, but the Fred who lived. Molly watched through tears as the memories played. There was Fred teaching Ron to fly. Fred giving Ginny her first pygmy puff. Fred at his Hogwarts graduation, grinning wildly, already planning the shop. Fred and George in perfect synchronization, finishing each other's sentences, moving like two parts of one whole. "Look at this one," Harry said softly. The memory showed Fred during the Battle of Hogwarts. Not the end, but earlier, when they'd all still been fighting. Fred was laughing, actually laughing, while hexing Death Eaters alongside Percy. And Percy was grinning too, the two of them working together after years apart. And Fred shouted something that made Percy laugh properly. And then Fred clapped Percy on the shoulder, and the memory faded, but the joy remained. Percy was crying silently, his hands covering his face. George moved to sit beside him, didn't say anything, just sat there, present, together. The memories continued to play, weaving in and out of each other, creating a portrait of a life lived loudly, joyfully, courageously. Fred hadn't been perfect. The memories showed his flaws too, his occasional cruelty, his recklessness, his talent for taking jokes too far. But they showed the whole person, not a saint, a brother, a son, a friend. When the last memory faded, the sitting room was quiet, except for the sound of people crying and trying not to cry and giving up on trying. "Thank you," George said to Lee. Thank you." Lee nodded, unable to speak. They sat together in the aftermath, passing around handkerchiefs and tissues. And nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say. The memories had said it all. Christmas morning arrived with snow and weak sunlight. Molly woke to the sound of movement downstairs. Unusual, since everyone had learned to let her wake first, to have her quiet moments before the day demanded participation. But today, someone was in the kitchen. She descended the stairs in her dressing gown and found George standing at the stove, attempting to make tea. "Morning," he said, without turning around. "I'm making breakfast, or trying to. I've forgotten how everything works." "I can help." "No." George set down the kettle. "I can do this. I should do this. Fred always—" He stopped, started again. "Fred used to make Christmas breakfast, burnt everything spectacularly. I was always the one who could actually cook, but he insisted on doing it anyway because he said Christmas breakfast should be terrible, that it built character." Molly smiled through her tears. "I remember. He once served scrambled eggs that were somehow both raw and burnt. A talent." George cracked eggs into a pan with determined concentration. "I'm not trying to replace him. I can't replace him, but I can. I can do the things he did, keep the traditions alive, even if I do them alone." "You're not alone," Molly said softly. George looked at her. and his eyes were full of pain and love and determination. "No, I'm not." They cooked together, Molly gently correcting George's technique, and by the time the others came down, breakfast was ready. It wasn't terrible. George was too competent a cook for that. But it also wasn't perfect, and somehow that felt right. After breakfast, they opened presents. The tradition had always been chaotic. Torn wrapping paper flying everywhere, exclamations over gifts. The Christmas jumpers Molly knitted every year in various states of appreciation. This year was quieter, more subdued, but still present. Molly had knitted jumpers for everyone. George's was purple, Fred's color. He held it for a long moment before pulling it on without comment. When all the gifts had been opened, George retrieved something from his pocket. "I have one more thing, for all of us." He pulled out a small velvet bag and emptied it onto the coffee table. 7 small golden coins tumbled out, each one gleaming with enchantment. "I've been working on these at the shop," George said. "They're communication coins, like the D8 galleons Hermione made, but different. If anyone needs to reach the family, needs help, or wants to talk, or just if anyone needs us, we'll know. All of us, immediately." He picked up one coin, showed them the enchantments etched into the surface. "I know we're scattered. Charlie in Romania, Bill at Shell Cottage, Ginny at Hogwarts. But we're still a family. We're still together. These are just a reminder." Percy picked up one of the coins, turning it over in his hands. "So, if I'm at the ministry and have a terrible day, we'll know," George confirmed. "And someone will respond. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not with solutions. But you won't be alone." They each took a coin. Hermione and Harry were given ones too, official recognition of their place in the family. The coins were warm, pulsing with magic and intention. "To Fred," Bill said, raising his coin, who would have loved an excuse to interrupt us at inconvenient times. "To Fred," they echoed, and for the first time in months, the name didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a celebration, a choice to remember with joy instead of only grief. That evening, they sat by the fire, all of them, squeezed into the sitting room, warm and full of Christmas dinner. And Molly looked around at her family, smaller than it should be, missing pieces that could never be replaced, but alive, together, surviving. The Weasley clock on the wall showed all hands pointing to home, all except one. But maybe, Molly thought, home wasn't just a place. It was this. It was choosing to be together, despite the pain. It was building new traditions while honoring old ones. It was love that continued even when the person you loved couldn't continue with you. Outside, snow fell softly. Inside, the fire crackled and the family sat together. And it was enough. For tonight, it was enough. March arrived quietly, without fanfare. The snow melted in patches, revealing the garden underneath, muddy and bedraggled, but beginning to stir with green. Molly stood at the kitchen window, watching the first crocuses push through the cold earth, their purple and yellow heads defiant against the lingering chill. Spring always came. No matter what happened, no matter who was lost, the earth turned and the seasons changed, and life insisted on continuing. It had been nearly a year since the Battle of Hogwarts. The thought arrived with surprising gentleness. A year. 12 months of learning how to breathe around the absence, how to function with a piece of herself missing, how to be Molly Weasley when one of her children was gone. She'd survived it. They'd all survived it, though survival looked different than she'd imagined. The Burrow was quieter now. Not silent. It would never be truly silent again. Not after Christmas. Not after they'd chosen to live loudly in Fred's memory. But different. Bill and Fleur visited regularly, bringing Victoire, who was walking now and chattering in a mixture of English and French. Charlie sent letters weekly, sometimes including photographs of dragons or pressed flowers from the Romanian countryside. Ginny came home for holidays, bringing stories of Quidditch and NEWTS preparation and life continuing at Hogwarts. And George had found something like equilibrium. He still had hard days. Days when he couldn't get out of bed, when the weight of Fred's absence was too heavy to carry. But they were becoming less frequent. The shop was thriving. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes had reopened to enormous success, customers flooding in with a hunger for joy after so much darkness. George, Lee, and Ron had expanded the inventory, hired more staff, even opened a small mail order operation that Percy managed with frightening efficiency. The memorial wall had become something special. Customers left memories, notes, photographs. The magical canvas George and Percy had created displayed them in constantly shifting patterns, moments of laughter, gratitude, love. Fred's impact on the world, made visible. George spent hours there some days, just watching, reading, bearing witness to the way his brother had touched people's lives. Ron had found his footing too. Working at the shop had given him purpose when he desperately needed it, a way to honor Fred while building something of his own. He and Hermione were together now, properly, officially together, navigating the complicated terrain of a relationship built on friendship, war, and shared trauma. They were young, fumbling their way through it, but there was something solid there, something real. And Percy had integrated himself back into the family with quiet determination. He worked at the ministry during the day and helped at the shop most evenings, making up for lost time in the only way he knew how, by showing up, consistently, without asking for forgiveness, but earning it through action. They were healing, not healed. Molly suspected that might never come, but healing, growing around the wound rather than being consumed by it. The first anniversary of the battle was approaching, and Hogwarts had planned a memorial service. The invitation arrived on a Monday, delivered by a school owl that looked far too serious for its job. Molly opened it at the kitchen table, Arthur reading over her shoulder. Dear Weasley family, we cordially invite you to attend a memorial service honoring those who fell during the Battle of Hogwarts, to be held on May 2nd at 2 p.m. in the Great Hall. The service will include remembrances, the dedication of a memorial wall, and a moment of silence for the fallen. We hope you can join us in celebrating the lives and courage of those who gave everything for our freedom. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall. Headmistress Molly set the letter down carefully. Do you want to go? Arthur was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Do you? I don't know either. It felt impossible, standing in the place where Fred died, marking the anniversary of the worst day of her life with ceremony and speeches. But it also felt wrong not to go, not to bear witness, not to stand beside the other families who'd lost people they loved. We should ask George, Arthur said finally. It should be his choice too. So that evening, when George came home from the shop, later than usual, exhausted in that productive way that meant he'd had a good day, they showed him the invitation. He read it silently, his expression unreadable. "I want to go," he said finally. "I need to go. I haven't been back since." He stopped, swallowed. "I need to see it. Need to make it real, maybe. I don't know, but I think I need to go." "Then we'll go," Molly said. "All of us. As a family." The letters went out. Bill confirmed he and Fleur would attend. Charlie sent word he'd returned from Romania for the service. Ginny would obviously be there, as she was still at school. Percy cleared his schedule. Ron and Hermione planned to come together. Harry would be there. He was always there for the important things. This boy who'd become her son in all but blood. The days leading up to the anniversary were strange. Molly found herself remembering that week last year with painful clarity. The fear before the battle, the chaos during, the aftermath, the bodies laid out in the Great Hall, the desperate search for her children, the moment she'd seen Fred's face and known, just known, that he was gone. She'd killed Bellatrix Lestrange that day. The memory should have brought satisfaction, but it only brought weariness. Vengeance hadn't brought Fred back, had changed nothing except the body count. The night before the service, Molly couldn't sleep. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Arthur, and descended to the kitchen. The house was dark, just the banked fire providing dim light. She made tea by wandlight, the familiar ritual soothing, and sat at the table where so many meals had been shared, so many conversations had happened, so much life had been lived. "Mum?" She turned. George stood in the doorway, also unable to sleep, also seeking the comfort of the kitchen at midnight. "Can't rest either?" she asked. He shook his head, crossed to the table, sat heavily. "Keep thinking about tomorrow, about going back there, seeing the place where..." He stopped, started again. "I don't know if I can do this." "You don't have to," Molly said gently. "We can stay home. No one would judge us." "I'd judge me." George's hands wrapped around an imaginary teacup. Molly stood to make him real tea, setting it before him with a mother's automatic care. "He died there. Fred died in that corridor. And I haven't been back. Haven't faced it. I've been hiding. You've been surviving. Same thing, maybe." George took a sip of tea, grimaced at the heat. "I keep thinking, what if I'd been faster? What if I'd seen the wall before it exploded? What if I'd pushed him out of the way?" "George, no. I know. I know it's not my fault. Everyone's told me that. The therapist you made me see told me that. But knowing something and believing it are different things." He looked at her, and his eyes were Fred's eyes, identical and heartbreaking. "Do you blame me?" "What?" "No. George, never. Because sometimes I see you looking at me, and I think you're seeing him. Thinking about how it should have been both of us, or neither of us. How I got to live, and he didn't." Molly's hands were shaking. She set down her teacup before she dropped it. "I see you, George. You, not Fred. You're not a replacement or a reminder. You're my son, and I love you, and I'm grateful every single day that you're alive. Even though Fred isn't, I can be grateful you survived and devastated Fred didn't. Both things are true. Loving you isn't betraying him." George's face crumpled. "I miss him so much. Every day, every hour. The shop is full of his ideas, his jokes, his magic. I can't escape him, and I don't want to, but it's so hard. Being the one who's left. Being half of something that was only ever meant to be whole." Molly rounded the table and pulled her son into her arms. He collapsed against her, this tall, grown man, who was still her baby, and sobbed, the way he hadn't let himself sob in months. She held him and rocked him and let him break. Because breaking was necessary sometimes. Because grief wasn't linear. Because healing meant falling apart and putting yourself back together over and over again. "You're not half," she whispered into his hair. "You're whole. You're George Weasley, and you're brilliant, and you're enough. Just you, just as you are." "I don't feel enough." "I know, but you are. I promise you are." They stayed like that until George's tears ran dry, and the tea went cold, and the sky outside began to lighten with the approach of dawn. Finally, George pulled back, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "Sorry," he said. "That was necessary," Molly finished. "Don't apologize for grieving." George nodded, stood, looked exhausted but somehow lighter, as if crying had released pressure that had been building for too long. "I'm going to try to sleep, for a few hours at least." "Good idea." He paused at the doorway. "Mum, thank you for everything, for not giving up on me, on any of us." "I'm your mother," Molly said simply. "Giving up isn't an option." George smiled, small and sad but genuine, and disappeared upstairs. Molly sat alone in the kitchen as dawn broke over the Burrow, and thought about the year that had passed, about the way grief had reshaped them all, worn them down, and rebuilt them into something different. They weren't the same family they'd been before the war, could never be that family again, but they were still a family, still together, still choosing each other, day after difficult day. The Great Hall was packed. It seemed like half of magical Britain had come to the memorial service. Families of the fallen sat in the front rows, Tonk's parents looking aged beyond their years, Lavender Brown's mother weeping silently, Colin Creevy's father clutching a photograph. The Weasleys sat together, a solid wall of red hair and determination, with Harry and Hermione folded into their ranks like they'd always been there. McGonagall spoke first, her voice steady but emotional, talking about sacrifice and courage and the price of freedom. Then other speakers took the stage, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Hannah Abbott representing the students, George's friend Lee Jordan, who spoke about Fred with humour and love and only broke down once. When it was time for families to come forward and light candles for their lost loved ones, Molly's legs felt like water. But Arthur took her hand, and George stood on her other side, and together they walked to the front of the hall. 50 candles waited on a long table, one for each person who died in the battle. Fred's candle was in the middle, marked with his name in McGonagall's careful script. George lifted his wand with a shaking hand and spoke the incantation. The candle burst into flame, not regular fire, but magical fire that would burn for exactly 1 year before needing to be rekindled. A promise that they would return, that Fred wouldn't be forgotten. Other families lit their candles, the hall filled with light, dozens of flames dancing in the enchanted ceiling that showed a perfect spring sky. And the names, all the names of the dead, appeared on the walls in golden letters, circling the hall in an endless procession. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevy, Lavender Brown. So many names, so many lives cut short. The moment of silence that followed was profound. Hundreds of people, not breathing, not moving, just bearing witness to loss that could never be adequately measured or mourned. When it ended, when McGonagall gave the signal and people began to move again, to speak in hushed voices, to comfort each other, the Weasley family stayed rooted in place, staring at Fred's candle. "I brought something," Percy said quietly. He pulled a small object from his pocket, one of Fred's skiving snack boxes, battered and worn. "From when we were young, before I left, before I was an idiot. I kept it all these years, couldn't bring myself to throw it away." He placed it at the base of Fred's candle, an offering, an apology, a bridge across years of estrangement. Ron added a pygmy puff from his pocket, a purple one, Fred's favorite color. Ginny left a quaffle, miniaturized with a shrinking charm. Bill contributed a dragon scale, something Fred had always wanted. Charlie left a photograph of them all as children, laughing in the Burrow's garden. George was last. He stood for a long moment, then removed something from around his neck. A thin chain with a small vial attached. Inside was a swirling silver substance. "What is that?" Molly asked. "A memory," George said. "The last good one, before the battle. Fred and I were in the shop, creating a new product. We were laughing about something stupid. He said..." George's voice broke. "He said he couldn't wait to see what we'd build next, what we'd create together." He placed the vial beside the other offerings. "This is what we built, Fred. This life, this family, this survival. It's not what we planned, but it's what we have." Molly couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. They stood together as a family, surrounding the candle, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt Fred there. Not literally, not as a ghost, but as presence, as love, as the threads that still connected them all to the boy who died too young, but lived so fully. After the service, they walked the Hogwarts grounds. The castle had been repaired, the battle damage erased by months of careful reconstruction. But if you knew where to look, you could still see traces, stones that were slightly different colors, new windows among old, the careful patching of history. They found the corridor where Fred died. Someone had placed flowers there, refreshed regularly by the house elves, or staff, or students who remembered. George stood in the exact spot, his hand pressed against the wall, and Molly watched her son face the place he'd been avoiding for a year. "It's smaller than I remembered," George said. "In my head, it's this massive space, but it's just a corridor." "Does it help?" Ron asked. "Being here?" "I don't know. Maybe. It's real now. Not just a nightmare I can't escape. It's just a place where something terrible happened, but also where Fred was brave, where we all were." George turned to look at them. "We're still here. That has to mean something." "It means we keep living," Ginny said. "We keep choosing life, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard," Hermione added. They stood together in that corridor, 7 people who'd survived when so many hadn't, and Molly realized something. Grief would never end. The Fred-shaped hole in their family would never close. But they'd learned to carry it, learned to build lives around the absence, learned that love didn't die when people did. They returned to the Burrow as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The garden was in full bloom now, Molly's months of work paying off in riots of color. Daffodils and tulips and primrose. The apple trees were covered in white blossoms. The pond reflected the sunset, peaceful and perfect. They gathered in the kitchen for dinner, all of them, even Charlie, who'd announced he was staying for a week, even Bill and Fleur and Victoire, who was more interested in throwing food than eating it. The table was crowded, chaotic, loud with conversation and laughter, and the sounds of a family that was very much alive. Molly looked around at her children, 6 of them present, 1 missing, and felt something she'd thought lost forever. Not happiness, not exactly, but contentment, gratitude for the ones who remained, pride in how they'd survived, hope that tomorrow might be easier than today. The Weasley clock on the wall showed all hands pointing to home, all except one, which remained frozen in time. But that was all right. Fred was home in a different way now, in the stories they told, in the shop George kept running, in the memorial wall covered with memories, in the way they chose to laugh despite the pain, in the fact that they were all here, together, refusing to let grief destroy what Fred had died defending. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room. Someone started a fire. George retrieved the modified pensive Lee had made, and they spent the evening watching memories, not just of Fred, but of all of them. Good memories, happy ones, proof that life, even marked by tragedy, still held beauty. As the night deepened and the fire burned low and people began yawning, Molly felt Arthur's hand find hers. They'd survived this year together, weathered the worst storm of their marriage, and somehow emerged still connected, still partners. "It's going to be all right," Arthur whispered. "Eventually, it's going to be all right." Molly leaned against his shoulder and watched her family, her loud, messy, broken, beautiful family, and believed him. Spring had returned. The garden was blooming. The Burrow stood crooked and sturdy against the darkening sky, and the Weasleys endured. Not unchanged, not undamaged, but enduring, together, always together. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough.